I had planned for my next video to be about Pieter Bruegel's The Parable of the Blind and how it echoes the shifting dynamics between my doggo Max and myself since he has gone blind. So I spent a few days on research for the piece, reading articles, book chapters, taking notes, refining my angle. I even found a copy of Gerrit Hofmann's The Parable of the Blind, a novel that reimagines the making of the painting from the perspective of the 6 blind beggars, and fed that into my material. But when it came time for the essay itself, the ideas that I was reaching for just weren't there. I spent a few mornings staring at a blank document, trying to force coherence out of something that refused to take shape. A few paragraphs emerged, but they all led, well, nowhere. And with them came that faintly terrifying sense of being utterly untethered from structure, from necessity, from any illusion that my actions were meaningfully ordered rather than simply occurring in an indifferent void. Because this is what being untethered feels like. The absence of a through line, the collapse of a ruling order that I had hoped would carry me through the week and give me something to hold on to, something that, even if destined for a handful of views, would still have been a kind of project, a reason to get up and face each day. Without it, time can become, for us, something that doesn't unfold so much as accumulate, pooling in dull, undifferentiated hours, waiting to be disposed of. This is what it feels like to be untethered, untethered in time, untethered in existence, suffocated by a relentless kind of deadness, where our waking hours are no longer lived or put to use, but merely endured, a slow, numbing accumulation of empty-ish moments, drifting forward without structure, without purpose or end. But perhaps I should begin by explaining first of all what I mean by this word tethered. The tether, as I am referring to it here, brings to mind a core dialectic at the heart of existentialism, one that Sartre develops in Being and Nothingness, a 918-page screed that you don't need to have read to grasp its essential idea, which is this: being is always tethered, tethered to habit, to role, to relationship, or to a project. Or, to put it phenomenologically, what it feels like to be you at any given moment is structured by these tethers, by these attachments. When the tethers are absent, when there is no narrative to hold on to, no structure of expectation or momentum to keep us moving forward, such as, I am writing a book, I am a person with responsibilities, I am in love with this person and they are in love with me, I have a place in this world, we are thrust back into formless nothingness, the groundless void from which we came. Most of us find this to be a frankly intolerable state, though we only acknowledge this intermittently, since to do so too often would make functioning in this realm of being a somewhat tricky affair. Perhaps this is what we imagine in the catatonic or deranged stasis of insanity, not a frenzy of delusion per se, but a kind of abyssal stillness, a loss of any tether to motion, to identity, or to necessity. Maybe this is what happened to Nietzsche in Turin when he collapsed in the street, arms wrapped around that flogged horse, weeping, as though in that moment the arbitrary structures of meaning he had spent his life interrogating had finally collapsed in on themselves, leaving him face to face with suffering, raw and unmediated, unbearable in its abject totality. The only interesting thing about being untethered, a state that also deeply correlates with depression, disorientation, existential anxiety, and that creeping sense of unreality, is that it makes glaringly apparent just how tenuous, arbitrary, and precarious being tethered to or in almost anything actually is for us human creatures. For as soon as our existential tethers, the word etymologically refers to a rope for fastening an animal to a fixed point, as soon as these existential tethers become apparent to us or slip from our grasp, we might also catch a glimpse of the terror they both conceal and protect us from. In Sartrean terms, the terror of radical freedom, the terror of absolute choice, the unbearable awareness that we are not bound to our human lives by necessity, but by the fictions we construct to shield ourselves from the void. And once seen, this cannot be unseen. Once the illusion of structure is ruptured, even reattaching ourselves to new tethers feels somewhat provisional, a game played in bad faith, because we know now, however dimly, that the leash was never real, only ever self-imposed. Sartre describes this feeling as a kind of nausea, which I would attest to as being the right word for that sickly ontological lurch, that empty, gnawing not rightness in the belly at the very moment in which facticity, that which grounds us, suddenly reveals itself as contingent, arbitrary, a scaffolding that could just as easily not be there at all. The tether, in this sense, is what keeps us from the raw confrontation with our own groundlessness, the recognition that all of our structures, all of our roles and narratives are ultimately self-imposed, comforting fictions that we maintained so as to avoid staring too long into the void of our own fundamentally untethered existence. Cue music for the Twilight Zone.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into...
There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. Put this way, it all sounds kind of hunky-dory. But even here, I think William Stafford shows us just how fragile our tethers are to that which is not, loss, hurt, suffering, and a sort of living meaninglessness. At this moment, I'm very aware of the handful, and it is just a handful of tethers, probably no more, that keeps me affixed to being as opposed to the terror of nothingness. Like just having a piece of content to make that interests me and that I hope will interest others in some way. The act of shaping an idea into something external, something made, allows me to feel as though I'm moving through time with some sense of direction rather than merely being dragged along by it. Also having someone else's content to focus on and think about above and beyond ephemeral distractions of social media, YouTube. At the moment it's The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse, which I'm listening to as an audiobook. But without that as a narrative, as well as the conceptual tether of that book, I, as a 4-wing-5, would be just utterly unmoored. I need a world beyond my own to sort of step into, a mind that is not mine to dialogue with, else I just kind of collapse inward. Also my clients, patients, fellow travelers, having people seeking me out, talking to me each day about their own struggles with life, provides me with a tethering effect of being able to, bear witness to other people's suffering and being part of their attempt to make meaning of their own chaos, even when sometimes I'm quite often unable to do the same for myself. Similarly, the couple of people I know who I can call friends and who, would give that name to me. Friendship as a tether is not, I think, about constant presence or emotional validation, but more about just being recognized, being known in a way that persists, even in silence. And without that, reality begins to feel like a closed system, and the self is just another boring echo chamber. And of course also Max. I still want this video to be about Max, so I'll come to him as a tether in a moment, but certainly, doing whatever is required for him on a daily basis is a fundamental existential tether for me. The act of caring for another being, of structuring my day around his needs, keeps me connected to the material world in a way that thought alone never could. So these are the threads then that in this moment are keeping me, if you like, from unraveling entirely. But even as I list my threads, my tethers, I am aware of their fragility, their contingency, the fact that each of these can, as I have experienced with that idea for the video the other day, each of these can be just killed off or rendered unusable. And when this happens, I am once again left facing just the blank, indifferent void of untethered existence, where time stretches featureless in all directions and the self begins to feel like an unnecessary addition to an already overcrowded setup. So that's a bit about tethers. Let's talk now about Pieter Bruegel and Max. So since Max went blind, we've had to adapt, understandably, to how we navigate the world together. When he walks beside me, as he did before losing his sight, we sometimes now misjudge, obstacles in his path, leading him to bump his head, something that pains me to witness. So for this reason, our main way of getting around now is with him trailing directly behind me, allowing, the creature who still has some sight to ensure the path ahead is clear for both of us. And when I'm leading him around like this, or perhaps vice versa, since he sometimes halts us or deviates from the path to relieve himself, an image often comes to mind, and that is Bruegel's famous painting, The Parable of the Blind, depicting a trajectory of a fall, a line of 5 blind men in progressive stages of losing their balance, each following the fate of their blind leader who has already tumbled into some kind of ditch or stream. Now that I'm responsible for guiding him through the obstacle course of the world, ensuring he doesn't crack his head on a sharp edge of a curb or stumble over a hidden dip, the pathos of that painting has become a kind of lived expression of our relationship. But also a question about the intrinsic worth of another creature, right? About altruism and care, which I suppose I'd like to wrestle with a little bit here in the time I've left of the tether of this video. My neighbor, a few weeks ago, learning that Max had gone blind, praised me for not putting him down, the implication being that a disabled dog could not perhaps justify the resources I was still investing in his care and existence, that without practical return, his life was maybe expendable. If relationships are of all kinds are tethered to utility, what the other does for us, what they add to our lives, then Max's blindness, and indeed Max himself, is often now a negative tether for me. Walking with him requires constant vigilance, scanning for obstacles that he cannot see. Our new way of moving, tethered in a line, like the blind in Bruegel's painting, is functional, but it robs us of the pleasure of walking side by side, of that kind of effortless synchronicity that we had before. Max, understandably, is now more hesitant, more fearful, and requires from me a patience that does not always come easily. And though I'm supposed to be leading in a sense, he is like that first blind beggar in Bruegel's procession, the one whose misstep sets the fate of all who follow him. If Max stops, if he drags behind, if he gets caught in an obstacle, I'm pulled with him. If he falls, we both go down. The writer and the critic John Berger calls Bruegel the interpreter par excellence of human indifference. The indifference of the peasant ploughing to Icarus falling, the indifference of the crowd hurrying to gape at the crucifixion, the indifference of the Spanish soldiers They were only obeying orders to the pleas of the Flemish, whom they loot and massacre. The indifference of the blind to the announcement that they are being led by the blind. The indifference of the drunk to the living. The indifference of those playing games to precious time passing. The indifference of God to death. I sometimes wish I could be more indifferent to Max, more godlike, we might say. You know, each winter in the UK feels to me like a sort of form of voluntary imprisonment. I don't have children, I don't have a partner. You know, one I could likely escape, if not for Max. Transporting a dog abroad costs many thousands of pounds, and beyond the expense, I wouldn't really want to subject him to a prolonged stint in a cargo hold, so we stay. The relationship I entered into a decade ago with this creature who is my fundamental quotidian companion, my tether, structuring my days and nights around him for the last decade, well, he can also be a bit of a drag, or to use an expression that men of a certain ilk might use about their wives, Max is now my ball and chain. Although I have never lived with another human for as long as Max and I have lived together, I think I now understand those couples who, after decades together, even whilst resenting each other in dozens, if not maybe 100 small niggling ways, still remain fundamentally tethered, bound by something maybe even deeper than love, deeper than habit, something that cannot be fully articulated. And maybe this is because we're animals, and the animals we lie down to and wake up to the next morning, human or canine, become the silent witnesses to our existence. Their presence, their breathing in the dark beside us is a constant anchor, a tether, a rhythm that syncs with our own. In my case, Max's presence is as much a tether to life as life itself, because to care for him is to remain embedded in the world, to be tied to something beyond myself, to a bond that asks nothing except to continue. Maybe this is what our religious traditions are always harping on about when they use words like love with a capital L to mean something more than just getting one's physical, emotional needs met from a romantic or sexual partner. Love, in this sense, is the tether that remains when everything transactional falls away. The act of staying, tending, witnessing, even when there's nothing to be gained. What else can we do but try and love these 5 beggars who have become lost and fallen into a ditch, perhaps on their way to the church's food bank meal? Or what can we do about this little beggar called Max, who, like me, is just alive, wants feeding, grooming, affectionate words or touch, just as much as I do? Which is not to say that in my more indifferent moments, I haven't considered what it might mean to hasten the end for Max, to free myself, as it were, to follow my self-focused desires, to untether myself from the responsibility, the limitation, the weight of caring for someone outside myself. But to kill him would be to kill me, to kill anything and everything good within me. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, describes the fundamental paradox of freedom, that we are always free, and yet this freedom is unbearable in a way, because it places the full weight of responsibility upon us. Every action is a choice, every choice a declaration of who we are. There is no escape, no objective moral law dictating what must be done, only the radical responsibility of deciding for ourselves every day, every minute, every hour. And so, even considering the possibility of cutting the tether, of choosing my own freedom over Max's continued existence, becomes a sort of Sartrean moment of absolute confrontation with choice, with responsibility, with the inescapable fact that I alone can define what my actions mean. If Max and I are truly bound together, if we are, as I suspect, not separate beings so much as 2 manifestations of a single relational existence, then to kill him, to kill anything, would be to kill myself. To cut the tether is not to liberate myself, but to unravel into nothingness, to render meaningless the very act of care that gives structure to my being, leaving only the weight of my own unbearable freedom. And so we bumble on with our tethers being lived out not as burdens, but as the quiet conditions of our existence, the lines that hold us in place even as we strain against them.
I'm just a little person, one person in a sea of many little people who are not aware of me. I do my little job and live my little life, eat my little meals, miss my little kid and wife, and somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away, I'll find a second little person who will look at me and say, I know you, you're the one I've waited for. Let's have some fun. Life is precious, every minute, and more precious with you in it. So let's have some fun. We'll take a road trip way out west. You're the one I like the best. I'm glad I found you, like hanging round you. You're the one I like the best. Somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away. Somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away. Somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere